Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, December 30th, and Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Happy Merry Christmas with a little bit late, and Happy New Year to you and all the people who are was looking to the show. So
Thank
that's
you.
my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get started, Colonel, with what's going on right now in Syria. It seems that as time goes by, it's getting much more complicated. Right now, we have some sort of proxy war between Turkey and the United States in Syria. On the other hand, the government in Syria is trying to, by the help coming from Qatar and Turkey, they're trying to do some sort of management in Syria, and Israel is attacking again and again. How do you find the situation there?
Well, that was a situation that was predictable, in fact, and in reality is just the logical uh, follow up after what we had in the last 10 years. In reality, the problem is that now we have an interesting panel of actors. Um, we have a terrorist organization that has taken over the government, and the West is struggling to explain that it's not a terrorist organization. Um, but at the end of the day, regardless of whether it's a terrorist or not, the fact of the matter is that they are in a power. They are in a power situation now. And then you have those actors like the Kurds, the US, the Turks, and Israel, without mentioning all the factions, because apparently what you have in several parts of Syria is that you have some Shia militias and things like that. Because in fact, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is not very powerful in reality. The whole government system collapsed very quickly. But in reality, the strength of the HTS is not that big, meaning that you probably have other actors that can challenge the power of HTS. I remember when I wrote my book on the fake news, I had a special chapter on Syria, and I had more than 150 armored groups fighting in Syria against the government. So those some of them are probably now affiliated to the HTS, but you have many groups that are still in the loose, meaning that you will have some conflict of interest and all that. And I'm not even mentioning the Kurds, because even within the Kurds, there are different factions. I mean, the obvious biggest one is the PKK, but there are other ones that have always fought against each other. So we had this in northern Iraq, by the way. We had this in Turkey, where you had those fight between Kurdish factions. And now we just added new actors. And the interesting thing is that you have the US, Turkey, and Israel are basically all allies, basically. But they have different interests. I mean, the US supports the Kurds, and the Turkey wants to get rid of the Kurds, meaning that this is a conflict of interest. You had this this poster that was published, and you could see it in the social networks. That it's a Turkish poster that says, "Yesterday it was Saint Sophia." I don't know how to say the former basilic of Istanbul. Today is the Umayyad, and tomorrow is Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is Jerusalem. meaning that apparently the Turks have ambitions that go beyond Syria, meaning that here again you may have a conflict of interest. And remember that Erdogan a few weeks ago said that he was ready to enter Israel in support of the Palestinians. So you have three allies, but at the same time, they have so diverging interests that it may well be that they fight each other. And you had this article in the American Enterprise Institute that said the US must be ready to kill Turks in Syria. You know? So meaning that the whole situation in Syria is extremely unstable. In at the tip of this instability, you have the HTS, which in itself is unstable because I'm not sure that I mean, they probably obviously have the support of the former officials of the former administration, but still, HTS, I'm not sure they are ready to rule or govern a country. They are challenged by other factions, and we may have other conflicts within domestic fights within Syria, and you have those factors. So I'm not sure that, I mean, I'm not sure. The name of the game was to dismantle Syria. And I think I've mentioned that on your channel already, that it basically it is the application of the Yinon plan that was designed in the late 80s and then was the base of the a study for the Israeli government that was called a clean break. And in fact, in that document, it was this idea that Syria should be broken into different parts. And I think I have mentioned that in your show, in a previous show, that in 2012 we have this report from the Defense Intelligence Agency that explains exactly what the US plans were for Syria. I mean, a Kurdish state in the eastern part, a Salafist principality in the southern part, and a Shiite part in the west of the country. Well, not exactly in this configuration now, but still, this was the idea of splitting Syria into different sub units, entities. And that was a plan that, in fact, was sponsored, or let's say, wished by Israel. Israel was always anxious having such a big country just next door. So this idea of splitting Syria has always been an aim of the Israeli policy. So basically we are in this situation, but again, I'm puzzled because my personal view is, regardless how we judge or assess the government of Bashar al-Assad, I think that making an administration or a government to collapse is not the best solution. I mean, regardless of how we feel about him, we should have helped him to build up a state instead of sponsoring its opposition. Because, and I think it's important to realize that when we read the media and some scholars, I mean, they tend to say that the revolution inside Syria was a domestic revolution. It's not exactly true. In fact, you had a lot of people coming from the outside. And what, in fact, creates this imbalance in Syria was the fact that after the invasion of Iraq by the US, they pushed all the Sunni extremist and radical elements into Syria. And these guys started to be a problem for the Syrian government. And in fact, when we see how the revolution started in Syria, it started in those areas, in those Sunni area that originally came from Iraq. So, and Giuliani himself used to be with al-Baghdadi in Iraq, and al-Baghdadi sent him in Syria to contribute to the establishment of an Islamic State in Syria. So it's definitely an uprising that came from outside and not from inside. Even if you may probably find some individuals inside the country, I mean, it's not exclusively, but in the major part of the insurgents came from outside. And the famous Free Syrian Army, which was made out of deserters of the Syrian Arab Army, and it was formed in Turkey under the auspices of Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood. And that traced back to the 80s when the Muslim Brotherhood was expelled from Syria by Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. And since then, you had cells of the Muslim Brotherhood that organized, and in fact, the Syrian National Army, the Syrian Free Army, the Free Syrian Army, sorry, and today the National Syrian Army are in fact an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in reality. So the whole uprising and the whole problems that you had in Syria came from the outside and not from the inside. It's also interesting because when I wrote my book on the governing by fake news, I looked at the pattern of the development of the insurgency, because you had also those Arab revolutions in Egypt and in Tunisia and things like that. But in Tunisia, as in Egypt, the revolution started in the cities, mostly with students, as usual. And you had the cities where, in fact, those places where very often you have this kind of revolutionary mood. But that was not the case in Syria. The revolution came from the countryside, precisely where you had all these refugees who were stationed or expelled from Iraq. So we have a situation that we could have helped Bashar al-Assad to solve this problem then. And because up to this war, we never talked about any atrocities and things like this. It came very much after 2011, meaning that we could have helped Syria in the early 2000s, but nobody wanted to do that because, again, the name of the game was to split Syria. It was not about having Bashar. By the way, in February 2012, the Russians made a proposal of having Bashar al-Assad stepping down, in fact. And Bashar al-Assad was ready to step down in 2012. But the Americans refused because they wanted to have a rationale for having this war. So this is extremely perverse. The whole thing is extremely perverse. And I don't understand the policy of Israel of feeling more secure by having a split country with a weak government rather than having a stable political environment, stable countries with a strong government and things like this. I never understood that, because it's interesting that that was probably in 2016 or something like that. The Israeli General Staff, in ranking the threats against the country, they put Iran in the first place, and Syria in the second place, and ISIS was probably at the 10th place. You know, it was not. It has never been considered as a threat by Israel, which is quite odd if you think about it. And what we see today is that HTS has been sponsored, supported, financed, partly by US and all that, but also partly by Israel. So we see this this policy of Israel of divide and rule. You know, that's the way Israel sees its foreign policy or its security policy, and they feel more comfortable having an unstable government, unstable environment, than having a stable one, which is it defies the logic that we have in Europe, for instance, because in Europe we have exactly the opposite view, that stability and cooperation and having governments that are respected and work and a working administration, that's a guarantee of security, in fact, but not for Israel. An aspect that can explain that is probably what Bezalel Smotrich used to say a few months ago, when he said that Damascus belongs to the greater Israel. So meaning that the view, and especially this particular government, which is extremely ultra-nationalist and ultra-religiously nationalist, if I can put it that way, this is a government that contemplates the idea of the greater Israel. And this is, in fact, this is the basic doctrine of the Likud of Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu comes from this part of the Likud that comes from the Haganah B, that it was considered in the late 20s and the 40s as the so-called Zionist revisionists, because in the 20s Palestine was composed both by the Palestine that we know today, that means Israel plus the occupied territories of Palestine, plus Jordan. At the time it was called Transjordan. And in the 20s, the British gave Transjordan to the Hashemite monarchy. They were expelled from Saudi Arabia, and the Brits gave them a territory which is Transjordan, which today is called Jordan. And but the Zionist revisionists always claimed that they have, in fact, that Jordan belongs to the greater Israel and belongs to the state of Israel, meaning that, and that's also interesting because we see that Jordan remains extremely quiet in all this conflict, but it might be the next target, in fact. I don't know when, I don't know in which form, but that if Israel continues to be led by extremists, we might have a situation where those Zionist revisionists, which is the current branch of the Likud of Benjamin Netanyahu, they can probably start claiming their rights on Jordan, as they claim their right on part of Syria and all that, and South Lebanon. And that's exactly the problem. The UNIFIL just said, or issued a statement a few days ago asking Israel to comply with the ceasefire agreement and to start packing and leaving the territory. But Israel does exactly the opposite. In fact, they have multiplied, since the signature of the ceasefire agreement, they have multiplied destructions. They have proceeded more into Lebanese territory, and they are doing the same in Syria. So we have, and that's probably the rationale for Israel to have unstable neighbors so that they can defeat them more easily. That's my explanation. I don't know if I'm right, but that's my feeling, that they have this kind of vision that it's easier to fight a split country with different factions and all that, rather than fighting a solid and robust state as Syria used to be under Hafez al-Assad. Remember that Syria was one of the actors of the wars in 1967 and 1979, 73. So that's probably the idea, that gives the idea to the Israeli that Syria must be destroyed as a state in order to improve the security of Israel. That's my explanation.
We know that Israel has destroyed almost all of the weapons and sites in Syria. And do you think that this attitude on the part of Israel would, because at the end of the day, we know that Turkey and Qatar are supporting these people in Syria. That's why they can bring in new weapons. They can provide them with weapons if they, I don't know what would be the policy in the future, but at the end of the day, that would make these people in Syria more dependent on Turkey. Is that a concern for Israel in a long run, or can we say that Israel and Turkey their interests can overlap?
Well, they will. I mean, they have, I would say, probably antagonistic interests, because some say that Turkey has still this kind of Ottoman understanding of the region. They want to recover the Ottoman grandeur. I'm not sure about this, but nevertheless, those territories, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm not sure that Turkey wants to engage into that. But at the same time, probably the Turks have understood that Israel is a troublemaker in the region. In fact, all the problems we had came from Israel. They managed to push the US to invade Iraq, to support factions in Iraq and also in Syria. So the role that Israel is playing is basically negative for the region, because it's a kind of they are kind of warmongers in this part of the world. And in essence, those who know this region, they see that these people are not very aggressive. I mean, and that's probably the reason why Israel can manage so easily to invade them, because these Arab countries are not very they don't have this kind of aggressivity that you feel. Also in the language, I used to work in peacekeeping operations with Syrian officers, and I never heard this kind of aggressive rhetoric that you hear from Israeli officers, for instance. On the contrary, and the same with Egyptian officers, Jordan officers. I used to work with. I had as colonel, I had also some of those officers under my command, uh, and I never had the feeling that the, there were people uh, with a culture of aggressivity, and that's probably the reason why they are a tempting prey for Israel, because Israel, since the very beginning of its existence, and I mean even before its independence, Israel has, in fact, gained all its territory by force. There is not a single square meter that was acquired by legal action. Uh, everything has been acquired by force. So this has been kind of a culture, if you want, and they took advantage of the loopholes into the international law or in the international the UN resolutions. But in essence, everything they have done is basically to invade the terrain of others. Uh, so we have here a different type of mentality. And remember that the Israelis are Europeans, basically. They're Europeans. And they're not Middle Eastern people. And they don't have that culture at all. And when you travel in these areas, you see that this Middle Eastern culture is more transactional. It's more about discussing, and there is barely aggressivity. And that doesn't mean that when they are engaged into conflict, they don't become aggressive. We have seen that in Syria. So, but in essence, the basic culture is a culture of resilience rather than a culture of confrontation, while Israel has this European culture of a confrontational culture. And that's probably the problem. Now, with as I said before, the problem is that Turkey might be pushed for some reason to be confronted with the US. And I'm not meaning about Israel. That's an open. To be honest, I don't see how the situation between Israel and Turkey can be solved. I mean, I hope it will be politically. But with the Kurds, it's we can assume that it will be confrontational. And here, the US tends to support the Kurds. So this idea that US might be prepared to kill Turks in Syria, I hope it will never come to that point, because on the other hand, Turkey and US are member of NATO. So we see here that we are in a kind of a jigsaw puzzle that is extremely complex, and I don't see exactly how this will end up, to be honest. But again, the problem is that now we have a power in place, regardless whether we see it as legitimate or not, or as terrorist or not. By the way, it shows the way the West understands the word terrorist. And I came across an article recently where I saw that an old Jew, a Holocaust survivor, by the way, was arrested in the UK because he said that Israel will not be able to defeat the Hamas. And this guy was arrested under anti-terrorist law. So we see that this guy, because he claims that Israel cannot defeat Hamas, is considered as a terrorist. But the same government, I mean the UK, sponsor a terrorist movement that is listed as terrorist by international institutions, and that has performed terrorist activities a few years ago. So we see that we use the word terrorists not as in a way to solve the problem, because I have written several books about terrorism, and I'm a military also, and for me it's very important that we have the right terminology when we want to address a problem, because each problem has its own solutions. And when we call something, as we define it as terrorist, that means that we have a policy to address terrorism. And when we use the word terrorist to define everything that doesn't please us, then you cannot have a consistent approach to the problem, because then you have a variety of problems that have exactly the same designation, and you are not able to adjust your strategies. That's exactly the reason why, by the way, the Western countries have not been able to solve the problem of Islamist terrorism, because they have a kind of emotional approach to the issue rather than a technical a technical approach to the problem. At the end of the day, fighting terrorism is an issue of I would say technique, but it's a matter of a strategy. But then you have to understand exactly, and all the terrorisms cannot be defeated in the same way. When you have a Marxist terrorist, it has its own logic, its own way of doing things, and you fight it in a certain way. When you have like environmental terrorism, for instance, that you have, I mean, now no longer, but you had this in a few years ago in Europe. Then you have to address it with different tools. And when you have Islamist terrorism, it requires other tools. So basically, each kind of terrorism needs a proper strategy. So when you use the word terrorism to define an old Holocaust survivor, what is your rationale? How can you? What does it mean to address terrorism? So, and now we have this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is still considered as a terrorist organization, but is empowered by the West to rule Syria. We have seen pictures or videos that show the way things happen in Syria, and this is not very nice, actually. You have summary executions, you have killings of civilians, and you have all the same thing you see happening in Gaza. In fact, you see that in Syria done by HTS. So this is, for me, this is the problem beyond what happens in the field is how can we, what is our understanding of the strategy we want to apply? How do we get out of this situation? What is the outcome of this? What is the exit strategy of all that? What will be the configuration of Syria at the end of the day? And I think nobody has really a view on that. And that's exactly what happened, by the way, in Iraq. The Americans entered Iraq, but they didn't realize how Iraq would be or should be after they leave. They didn't even understand what is the criteria to leave, what is the exit strategy. You had exactly the same thing in Afghanistan, by the way. You had exactly the same thing in Libya. We toppled Gaddafi, but then, so what? There is no plan. The plan seems to be just to create chaos. And that's exactly what we have in Syria. And that's a source of concern for me, because I worked in high-level staffs in different capacities, in particular intelligence. But for me, it's always the question: what's next? What do you want to achieve next? And nobody seems to ask these questions. And that means that we launch crisis without knowing exactly what we want to achieve. And my concern is that at the end of the day, we may have a situation in which Turkey might want or be pushed to confront Israel. And then, so what? What happens? If, assuming that everybody understands that Israel is, which the ICG has not ruled yet, but assuming that Israel is a genocidal state, what would be the reaction of all these neighbors? The temptation to get rid of this government would be very strong, I assume. So we have created a lot of instability, and that doesn't just come from the government of Israel, but it comes from the Western powers, and namely the classic ones: US, UK, France, because these are the powers that have an historic responsibility on this region. Remember that Syria was under, and Lebanon were under French mandate for decades. Palestine was under British mandate, and the US has never had a mandate, but it managed to do as if. So we have we have increased the instability of the world, in fact, by toppling Assad. And again, I'm convinced that had people better understood what was the uprising about in 2011, 12, and so on, probably we might have helped Bashar al-Assad to restore the rule of law, to restore a state that works according to Western standard. And I told you that I know people who used to live in Syria before 2011. And you had none of this accusation against Bashar al-Assad that you had afterwards. I mean, you probably had some problems in prisons and all that. That's possible. But nobody was talking about it. And even foreigners who lived in Syria, not Syrians. So my view is that we missed an opportunity to create a safe and stable environment in the Middle East. And we missed this opportunity 15 years ago. But again, that was the dynamics of the time. The French wanted to topple Gaddafi. They have done so. The US helped reluctantly, but they helped. And then all those, not all, but a part of the fighters in Libya were in fact those who came in Syria to fight against the Bashar al-Assad government. I don't know if I have here, probably I have here a chart showing the various groups or countries that were involved in the first war in Syria. Well, that's here. And let's put the French one. Sorry, it's in French, but here we go. So these are the combatants coming from different countries fighting in Syria in 2014. And you see that you had just 15,000 coming from Libya, from Turkey, Tunisia, Lebanon, and so on and so forth. So the war in Syria was definitely something coming from the outside, with the help of the Western countries. So we completely destabilized this part of the world without exactly knowing what we wanted to achieve. I mean, obviously, we didn't want to have Bashar al-Assad anymore, but that's it. And exactly the same as Gaddafi. I mean, today you still have a mess in Libya with not recognized government and things like this. And so you still have factions fighting each other and all that. So we just create chaos. And that's the policy of the West, not just the US, because as I said, Libya was mainly a French initiative with the British, I mean, with the help of the British, but the French were instrumental in creating the Libya problem. And they invented also the massacre of Benghazi and things like this, just in order to justify the intervention. And at that time, Russia and China didn't realize that what was the aim of the Western powers, and allowed an operation, a no-fly zone over Libya. But so they share some kind of responsibility. But in fact, this is typically a problem created by the West, created by France, UK, and the US. It's always the same suspects, the usual suspects.
Yeah. Carl, when you look at the bigger picture of Syria and what's going on with Israel right now, the situation in Gaza not solved for Israel, in Lebanon the same way, and as you've mentioned, in Syria is a total chaos, and nobody knows what's going to come out of this huge mess that we're witnessing right now in Syria. And we have Yemenis capable of hitting the heart of Tel Aviv, and on the other hand, they're bringing down the US drones. And I don't know, they were talking about it was an F-18 that the United States said it was accidentally done by the US, but Yemenis are claiming that they did that. They shot down the fighter jet of the United States. But after all, when you see Yemenis, and recently Israelis were talking about making an alliance against Yemenis, is that possible to defeat Yemen?
Well, I don't know if you have an alliance and a coalition against Yemen. I mean, they will do as usual to bomb and have carpet bombing on Yemen. But the interesting thing is that the aim of the Yemenis is to force Israel into a ceasefire. That's the purpose of the action. Meaning that, in fact, the Yemenis are simply implementing the principle of the United Nations, which is the responsibility to protect. And as you know, the responsibility to protect has three pillars. The first one is an institutional one within the country. And obviously, the Israelis have absolutely no intent to protect the civilians. And you even have countries like Germany. Annalena Baerbock used to say that the civilian population has no right to be safe. So this is just amazing to hear that from a Western country. especially Germany, who was probably not the best example in that matter. But the thing is that the first pillar is the institutional within the country. The second pillar is the political action of other countries. And in that, you can probably count with the ICG, this claim of South Africa against Israel for the suspicion of genocide and things like this. That could be part of the second pillar. But obviously, the second pillar is it doesn't move very fast, and I'm not sure it's very effective because at the end of the day, Western countries will make every effort to prevent this judgment of the ICG to be issued and to have a combination of Israel. And the third pillar is the direct action by external actors to prevent the destruction, genocide, extermination, or things like that of civilian population. These are the three pillars of the so-called R2P, or responsibility to protect. So the Houthis, in fact, are implementing this R2P principle, a UN principle, by bombing Israel. What strikes me is that other countries that are in fact neighboring countries like Egypt, Jordan, Syria, it's a little bit late now. The Hezbollah has done that also participated in this effort in protecting civilians. But countries like Jordan and Egypt and other Arab countries do not take the responsibility to protect the population of Palestine, because it's an obligation, in fact. You know, the R2P concept was adopted a few years after, but the idea was to prevent situations such as what happened in Rwanda in the mid-90s. And to empower, in fact, neighboring countries and the international community to intervene when they see that you have a genocide in running or things like that. And that was the rationale for the responsibility to protect. And when I was head of the policy and doctrine of the peacekeeping operations in New York, in the UN, I worked quite extensively on this responsibility to protect. It's a very interesting subject because we understand what it means, we understand what is the objective, but nobody wants to take the responsibility of doing something. It's very, very interesting. Even if we have the example of Rwanda, and here for Palestine, which obviously is a conflict that targets the civilian population. Nobody does anything, and you don't have enough. All those Western countries that are claiming values and all this kind of thing to help Ukraine, they are not helping Palestine in any way. So here, the Houthis and the Hezbollah, in fact, have, applied the R2P. So that's the first thing. So if you have a coalition against the Yemen, that would be interesting because they're implementing a principle of the United Nations, and you have a coalition that would fight against that. So that's quite interesting. So we have the West fighting against the application of international law. So this is but of course the reason why we do so is because we portray the Houthi as terrorists, of course, because they bomb naval ships, U.S. or British ships in the Red Sea, or military installations in Israel, and they are considered as terrorists. But again, that's come to the same discussion we had before, that we use the word terrorist just as it suits our interest, not in a factual and technical way. So that's the situation I see. But it's interesting to see that despite all the violence, all the distractions that Israel has performed in Gaza, obviously, but also in Yemen, because they bombed there. They almost missed the WHO director, by the way. So this is this shows also the ruthlessness of Israel, by the way. But okay. But the interesting point is that you had a couple of days ago the Palestinians firing a long-range missile from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to Jerusalem. And that's very interesting. The two missiles were fired from Beit Hanun, which is very north of the Gaza Strip. It's a place that has been destroyed many, many times, that Israel has invaded many, many times, that has destroyed almost all buildings. And still, Palestinians are able to fire those long-range missiles. So it's not a small missile, it's a long-range missile. That means it's quite a big engine that they use to fight. Meaning that we see that Israel, despite all the brutality of its action, is not able to master the problem. They have, and that's the same in South Lebanon. They destroy a lot of villages. They destroy a lot of Christian churches, a lot of heritage building and things like this, and civilian population as well. But they don't achieve much, and that's quite interesting, because it shows two things. First of all, it shows the inability of Israel to have a strategy focused on clear objectives, unless the objective is just to destroy population, which that could amount to genocide, by the way, if the intent is to destroy population. If it's not there, if it's not that, then what is the objective? Because at operational level, they achieve nothing, just distractions. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is that the West, in general, all the Western countries, have not managed to bring Israel to a more rational behavior in the region. Since 1947, Israel just violates all the international laws, and that's a reason why Israel is the more, let's say, you have more resolutions against Israel, because Israel doesn't respect the international law. And that's a matter of principle, by the way. It's not just casually so. Since the very beginning, I remind you that in order to be part of the United Nations, in 1949, 1 year after its independence, Israel had, as a condition to be part of the United Nations, Israel had to declare officially that it would abide by international law, including the right of return for the Palestinians. That was in 1949. Another condition to be part of the United Nations. And since then, they never They have never done anything in that direction. And that's why I'm saying this is kind of a philosophical or ideological approach to the international law. They don't accept international law. This is their law, period. And we had all these sanctions against Russia, and we had sanctions against Syria and so many countries. Despite all the resolution that condemn the behavior of Israel, there is no real sanctions. So that's extremely disturbing, in fact. And what we see today is, in fact, the civil society tends to take over from the institutional organizations, because we see the effect of the boycott, the investment and sanctions, BDS movement against Israel. And you have a lot of companies, Western companies, who tend to avoid Israel because it's bad for the image. And I don't know if it's for legal reasons, but it's probably for the image. But that's another way to approach the problem. And we see that now we have this the social society taking over, and it's quite effective. Now you have some countries that have decided to arrest Israeli soldiers that are recognized as war criminals. And I might be wrong, but I think it's in Australia. You had two young Israelis who used to be soldiers in Israel, who have been arrested for war crimes in Gaza. So we see that slowly people understand that if Israel is considered as a genocidal state, which is not yet the case, let's be clear, but if it, then how can you justify economic ties or financial support or military supply or deliveries to Israel when it's recognized as a genocidal state? So that's why I'm a little bit confused about the slow response of the ICG to this issue, because I think it's something that would have a definite impact on the way this conflict is waged, and probably it could press Western countries to make pressure on Israel so that Israel becomes a normal state, not just a rogue state that does everything what it wants, but a state that abides by international law, and with all the consequence of that. And that can only be done through the pressure of Western countries. I mean, the allies of the friends of Israel should help Israel to be back on the right track. That's my personal view.
Do you see that coming? Do you see, because Israel is right now is talking about attacking Iran before Donald Trump takes office, and how is that going if they do with that plan, attacking Iran? What do they want to achieve in your opinion? And is Israel capable of escalating the situation? Because so far, from what we've heard from Donald Trump, he's not interested in any sort of war in the Middle East. And because his main focus, as we've heard a lot of things from Donald Trump recently, Greenland, Canada, Mexico, and all of these, it shows that he's so much concerned about China.
Yes, definitely so. But at the same time, he has very strong ties with Israel. Remember that he was the president who recognized Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. And that's a decision that none of the US president dared to make before. And he also recognized the annexation of the Golan by Israel. And I think the Golan Heights are called or nicknamed by Israel the Trump Heights. So the problem with Donald Trump is that to some extent he is unpredictable. Yes, definitely his priority will be China, because China challenges the power of the US. And that comprises two main activities, if you want. One is to restore the industrial base in the US, the domestic industrial base, and at the same time to keep China down. That's probably, if I can read or summarize what he said, this is that. As to other conflicts, definitely Trump he doesn't want to spend money on conflicts that are hopeless. That's exactly the case for Ukraine. And he has recognized, as more and more politicians now in Europe, that the conflict in Ukraine leads nowhere. I mean, it leads to the destruction of Ukraine, basically. So if we want to keep a bit of Ukraine, we should probably find an arrangement with Russia. And that is suddenly Trump has understood. At the same time, US has provided something like $180 billion help to Ukraine, and obviously it's a lot of money and for nothing. So it's an investment with no return, in fact. So that's definitely not in the mentality of Donald Trump. So I can here it's relatively clear that Trump has considered that Ukraine is not his fight. That was the fight of Biden and Blinken and Victoria Nuland, but Blinken and Victoria Nuland came from this region. Remember that both of them they came from a family that originated in Ukraine. So there is probably other aspects than just geopolitical aspects in that. But this is a psychiatrist can probably address this question. In any case, that was Biden's fight. But Trump definitely doesn't want to get rid of this conflict. This is not the image of a powerful and victorious US. So therefore, it has to be shut down and period. The problem with Israel is a little bit different, because the relationship with Israel, between the US and Israel, is much tighter than the US with Ukraine or so, because of the very strong Zionist presence in the US, the very strong Jewish minority in the US, and it's a minority which is extremely influential. Therefore, you need them. There is no question. And a US president cannot ignore that. And that's exactly what Trump understands. And that's probably the reason why he recognized Jerusalem and the annexation of the Golan Heights. In the future, we know that, he has said that he doesn't want to support the conflict. He wants the killing to be stopped in Palestine. So we can expect that he does something. But at the same time, I think if anyone in his team wants to support Israel, that would be very difficult for him to say no. And therefore, we are back into the system we have seen since the late 60s, that Israel can allow itself everything, basically, and it will be protected by the US. Therefore, maybe the US will say, okay, you can do whatever you want, but we will not help you. That's an option. I mean, they will provide the political support, but not more than this. That's a possibility. But again, it's very hard to predict how Trump will react to that. He said, by the way, on several occasions, that the Palestinians are terrorists. So, it's very hard to understand or to anticipate what Donald Trump wants to do in Palestine. He has an historic relationship with Israel. He has this understanding that we have in many European countries, by the way, that the Palestinians are simply terrorists. And therefore, there is little incentives for him to find, let's say, a balanced solution for this conflict. I don't know. Again, this will be, once he will be in office, probably he will act differently, because today he is still not in office. So meaning that today it's just words. And words, that's the easiest part. Now, when it comes to action, and that's what he will have to do in about 3 weeks from now, then we'll see what he wants to do and what his advisors want to do. But we have a lot of, when you see Marco Rubio and others, I mean, I'm not very confident to see here a kind of a peaceful an appeasement in the situation, because these guys are warmongers, basically, and you have a lot of them in the Trump team. So definitely the focus will be on China. Probably he will do what he said once, that he wanted to be closer to Russia in order to avoid Russia to be closer to China. So it was the idea that if the US is closer to Russia, then Russia will not be so close to China. China is the objective, definitely. But so that's clear. But for the rest, I don't know. The question will also be because a lot of problems that comes for the new administration, I mean the US administration at large, is of course the cost of the military presence all over the world. It's a huge amount of money, and it's probably, I mean, I don't know if it's worth the price, and we might have another look at this from the Trump administration, having something which is a little bit more rational, financially speaking, I mean. And but again, I don't know, meaning that they might want to concentrate in the areas where they see a challenge, namely China, probably, and most probably Iran. But when you say seeing a challenge in Iran, meaning that they will probably side with Israel. You see. So I don't see an appeasement in the Near East with Trump. He might not be as warmonger as Biden, probably, but I don't see here a rationale for a real appeasement in the region.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colin, for being with us today.
That
Great
was my
pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much. Thank you.